A terrified bride was forced into a locked room with a crippled mafia boss she believed was powerless to protect her. But when killers broke down the door, his next move shocked her to the core and changed the entire underworld in a second. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. 3 weeks before the door locked on her wedding night, Nora stood in the corner of her father's study, trying to make herself small enough to disappear into the wallpaper. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and desperate ambition. Her father, a man whose gambling debts were etched into the dark circles under his eyes, poured a drink for the guest with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. The guest didn't drink. He was a man made of sharp angles and expensive tailoring, the consigliere to the Rojas family. He looked at the study's peeling paint with open disdain before turning his cold gaze to Nora. He didn't look at her like a woman. He looked at her like one might inspect a used car for hidden rust. "She's healthy," her father stammered, the ice rattling in his glass. "Educated. Quiet. She'll be good for him. A comfort." The consigliere finally sat, placing a leather folder on the desk with a heavy thud. "Let's not pretend this is a romance, Mr. Bellin. Victor Rojas is not looking for a lover. He is a man who cannot walk, cannot stand, and barely speaks. The streets say the great lion of the city is rotting in that wheelchair, waiting for the grave." Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty window. She had heard the stories. Victor Rojas had been a legend once, a man who held the city's throat in his fist. But after the ambush 3 years ago, he had become a ghost story, a broken relic hidden away in his fortress, managing a crumbling empire through silence and proxies. "He needs a wife to secure the legacy," the consigliere continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "To show the other families he is still functioning. Someone to push the chair and look pretty in the photos until the inevitable happens." "And the debt?" her father asked, his voice pitching high with greed. "The 60,000? Erased," the consigliere said. "Plus a monthly stipend for your silence." Nora watched her father's eyes light up. There was no hesitation, no moment of paternal regret. He didn't look at her. He looked at the leather folder. In that moment, the silence in the room screamed. She wasn't a daughter anymore, she was a transaction. A liquidation of assets. "Done," her father breathed, signing the paper without reading the fine print. The consigliere stood up, buttoning his jacket. He walked over to Nora, invading her space, smelling of mint and gun oil. "Pack your things, Miss Bellin," he said softly. "You belong to the ghost now. Try not to break him, he's fragile." As the door closed behind him, Nora looked at her father, who was already celebrating with a fresh drink. She realized then that she wasn't just marrying a crippled man, she was being buried alive with him. The reception hall was a golden cage, dripping with crystal chandeliers and the low, buzzing murmurs of men who carried guns under their tuxedos. To anyone watching from the balcony, it looked like a royal wedding. To Nora, standing beside the wheelchair in her heavy satin gown, it felt like a funeral with an open bar. Victor sat motionless, his hands resting limply on his lap covered by a thick black blanket. He looked smaller in the chair than he had in the photos, his face pale and unreadable behind dark sunglasses. He was a statue of a man, silent and seemingly absent. One by one, the captains of the Rojas crime family approached the dais to pay their respects. They didn't bow, they leaned down, invading his space, their smiles sharp and predatory. They were vultures circling a carcass that hadn't quite stopped breathing. "You look tired, boss," one captain said, gripping Victor's shoulder a little too hard, his fingers digging into the fabric of the suit. "Don't worry about the shipment tonight. We handled it. You just rest." Victor said nothing, merely nodding a fraction of an inch. Nora felt a strange, cold knot form in her stomach. She had spent weeks terrified of this man, imagining a tyrant who would crush her. But looking at him now, surrounded by wolves pretending to be sheep, she realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't the monster. He was the prey. Then came Marco, Victor's second in command. He was handsome in a greasy, violent way, smelling of expensive cologne and arrogance. He didn't just lean down. He crouched, bringing his face inches from Victor's, effectively cutting Nora out of the conversation. "Beautiful wedding, Victor!" Marco grinned, his eyes scanning the room as if measuring drapes for a house he already owned. "Enjoy the night. Savor it. You've earned a long, deep sleep." The threat was so thinly veiled it was practically naked. Marco patted Victor's cheek, 2 taps, patronizing and disrespectful, before straightening his jacket and winking at Nora. It was a look that said, "You're next." Nora looked down at her new husband. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't spoken. He just stared straight ahead, accepting the humiliation with the passivity of a man who had already given up. For the first time, the fear in Nora's chest was replaced by a hollow, aching pity. She touched the handle of his wheelchair, an instinctive urge to shield him, not realizing that beneath his stillness, the lion was simply counting down the seconds. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing them in the penthouse suite. To Nora, the sound echoed like the latch of a cell. The room was expansive, a vista of cream velvet and city lights, but the air inside felt thin, suffocating. She stood near the entrance, her fingers cramping around the crushed stems of her bouquet, terrified to move. This was the moment she had dreaded for 3 weeks, the moment she would have to perform the duties of a wife to a man she didn't know. She took a trembling breath and turned toward Victor. He had wheeled himself to the center of the room and stopped, his back to her. The pity she had felt downstairs washed over her again. He looked so isolated in that chair, a broken king in a silent castle. "Do you?" Her voice cracked, and she cleared her throat. "Do you need help with your jacket?" Victor didn't answer. He didn't turn around. He was staring at the digital clock on the bedside table, watching the seconds tick over. 11:42 p.m. "Victor?" she whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. "Stay there." The voice stopped her cold. It wasn't the raspy, weak whisper she had heard at the altar. It was low, steady, and sharp as cut glass. Victor slowly rotated his chair to face her. The lethargic, drug-hazed glaze she had seen in his eyes downstairs was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. In its place was a cold, predatory clarity. He wasn't looking at her dress. He was scanning the room, his eyes darting from the vents to the door jamb with the precision of a soldier clearing a bunker. He glanced at his wristwatch, tapping the face of it once. "You're standing in the light," he said. Nora blinked, confused. She was standing under the entryway chandelier. I can turn it off if..." "Get away from the window," Victor commanded. The order didn't leave room for argument. "Move to the alcove. Stay in the shadows. Do not make a sound." The atmosphere in the room shattered. The awkward, heavy tension of a forced wedding night evaporated, replaced instantly by the metallic taste of adrenaline. Nora looked at the floor-to-ceiling balcony doors. The sheer curtains were billowing slightly in the night breeze. She looked back at Victor. He wasn't the invalid she had married. His posture had shifted. His hands weren't resting limply on his lap anymore. They were gripping the armrests of his chair, white-knuckled and ready. He looked like a coiled spring. "Victor, what is happening?" she asked, her voice trembling, backing away from the glass as he ordered. "We have company," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the balcony. "And they didn't bring a gift." The chandelier flickered once, a dying spark in the crystal, and then the room plunged into absolute darkness. The sudden absence of light felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against Nora's chest. The hum of the air conditioning died with a groan, leaving a silence so profound she could hear the blood rushing in her own ears. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the faint, ghostly glow of the city skyline filtering through the sheer curtains. Then, the world exploded. The floor-to-ceiling glass doors leading to the balcony didn't just break, they disintegrated. The sound was a deafening, wet crash, like a wave of ice slamming into the earth. Shards of safety glass sprayed across the expensive Persian rug, skittering over the floorboards like diamonds. Nora gasped, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a scream that died in her throat. Through the gaping maw of the broken window, shadows poured in. There were 3 of them. They moved with a terrifying, fluid silence that was far worse than any shouting match. Dressed in tactical black, their faces obscured by balaclavas, they looked less like men and more like voids cut out of the night. There was no hesitation, no scanning for loot. They weren't thieves. They were exterminators. Nora pressed her back against the cold plaster of the alcove wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her legs refused to move. The instinct to run was there, screaming in her brain, but her body was frozen in primal terror. She watched, wide-eyed and helpless, as the intruders raised their weapons. The moonlight caught the matte black finish of the suppressors attached to their pistols. Long, ugly barrels designed to turn murder into a whisper. They didn't look at her. They didn't care about the witness yet. All 3 weapons leveled instantly at the center of the room. The red laser sights danced across the velvet furniture before converging on a single point, the man in the wheelchair. Victor sat motionless in the center of the kill zone. He looked small in the dark, a sitting duck silhouetted against the chaos. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't beg. He simply watched death approach. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking out, bracing herself for the wet thud of a bullet hitting flesh. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she was about to become a widow before she had even been a wife. The first assassin adjusted his aim, his finger tightening on the trigger, and the silence of the room stretched to its breaking point. The silenced gunshot was a pathetic sound, a sharp thwip like a dry branch snapping. The bullet shredded the leather headrest of the wheelchair, sending a puff of white stuffing into the air like snow. But the bullet found no flesh. In the fraction of a second between the trigger pull and the impact, the impossible happened. Victor didn't slump over. He didn't cower. He stood up. It wasn't the shaky, struggling rise of an invalid. It was an explosion of kinetic energy. The black blanket covering his legs was kicked aside, revealing powerful, muscular legs that drove him upward with terrifying speed. The man who had been wheeled down the aisle hours ago, looking as fragile as parchment, erupted from the chair with the velocity of a striking cobra. Nora's brain couldn't process the image. It defied 3 years of rumors, 3 years of the Broken King. Victor moved with a fluidity that was almost unnatural. He stepped into the space the bullet had just vacated, closing the distance to the lead assassin before the man's brain could register the empty chair. Victor's left hand shot out, not to block, but to seize. He grabbed the assassin's gun arm, twisting it outward with a sickening crack of bone that echoed louder than the gunshot. The assassin grunted, a sound of pure shock, but Victor gave him no time to scream. With military precision, cold, practiced, and devoid of hesitation, Victor drove his right palm into the man's throat, collapsing the windpipe. In one fluid motion, he spun the choking man around, pulling him close and using him as a meat shield just as the second assassin opened fire. Bullets thudded into the body of the first gunman, jerking him like a marionette, but Victor stood tall behind him, unharmed, unshaken. He wasn't a cripple. He was a titan. And as he looked over the shoulder of the dying man, his eyes locked onto the remaining intruders with a look that promised absolute annihilation. Nora stopped breathing, her hands trembling against the wall. The monster wasn't in the wheelchair. The monster was standing on 2 legs, and he was magnificent. The suite exploded into chaos, lit only by the strobe light flashes of muzzle fire. Victor didn't just fight, he dismantled. He shoved the bullet-riddled corpse of the first assassin into the second man, turning their own brutality against them. The gunman stumbled under the dead weight, his aim going wild, shattering a vase near Nora's head. Nora screamed, curling into a ball, but Victor was already moving. He wasn't the frail invalid she had pitied, he was a blur of violence. He closed the distance with a terrifying, pent-up energy, the result of 3 years of static rage finally being unleashed. He drove his shoulder into the second assassin's chest, the impact audible even over the ringing in Nora's ears. The man hit the heavy oak dresser with a bone-jarring crunch, crumbling to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. The third assassin, realizing the mission had gone catastrophically wrong, panicked. He scrambled back toward the shattered balcony doors, raising his weapon not at Victor, but at Nora. He sought leverage. A hostage. "Don't move!" the assassin screamed, his voice cracking with fear. Victor didn't hesitate. He didn't negotiate. He grabbed the heavy, steel-framed wheelchair, the very symbol of his supposed weakness, and hurled it with one hand. The chair spun through the air and crashed into the assassin's legs, sweeping him off his feet just as his finger tightened on the trigger. The shot went wide, burying itself in the ceiling. Before the man could recover, Victor was on him. He moved with the grace of a predator closing in on wounded prey. He pinned the assassin against the jagged remains of the glass door, his hand clamping around the man's throat. There was no struggle, only a brief, wet gurgle as Victor exerted pressure. He looked into the man's eyes, not with anger, but with a cold, hollow indifference. "Who sent you?" Victor asked, his voice a low rumble. The assassin gasped, his eyes rolling back, trying to mouth a name. Victor didn't wait for the answer. He already knew. He tightened his grip, and the man went limp, sliding down the wall to join the wreckage on the floor. Victor stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving slightly, the moonlight glinting off the sweat on his brow. He looked around the room, at the bodies, the shattered glass, the overturned furniture, and then he turned his eyes to Nora. He wasn't the man she married. He was a stranger soaked in blood, terrifying and magnificent, the king of a jungle she hadn't known she was entering. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Smoke from the pistol barrels drifted up toward the ceiling, hanging in the air like a gray phantom. Nora was still pressed against the wall, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and fixed on the man standing amidst the ruin. The smell of cordite and copper filled the room, a metallic tang that coated her tongue. Victor didn't bask in the victory. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a white silk handkerchief, and methodically wiped a splatter of blood from his knuckles. The movement was so mundane, so civilized, it made the violence he had just committed feel even more terrifying. He walked toward her, a steady, heavy gait. No wheels. No weakness. The floorboards creaked under his weight, a sound she had never associated with him before. "Nora," he said. His voice was steady, the weak, breathy rasp he had used for 3 years completely gone. It was a baritone rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. She flinched as he approached. "You can walk," she whispered, the words coming out as a breathless accusation. "All this time, you could walk." "Yes." 3 years, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and anger. "The newspapers, the doctors, your own family, they all said you were broken. I let them say it," Victor replied calmly, kicking a shard of glass aside with a polished dress shoe. "A strong king fights constant rebellions. A dying king, he just invites the vultures. I needed to know who was loyal and who was waiting to carve me up. The only way to see the knives was to turn my back and pretend I couldn't move." He gestured to the bodies sprawled on the floor. "Marco. My own lieutenant. If I had stood up yesterday, he would have smiled and shaken my hand. Tonight, because I sat in that chair, he sent his best men to butcher me. The chair was never a prison, Nora. It was a trap." He stopped directly in front of her. Standing, he towered over her, his broad shoulders blocking out the moonlight. The shift in perspective was dizzying. She had spent weeks looking down at him, and now she had to crane her neck to meet his gaze. He looked down, his dark eyes softening just enough to show the human beneath the killer. I didn't choose you to suffer, Nora. I chose you because I needed the world to believe the act was complete. A wife for the dying man makes the lie convincing. He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, then gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her trembling face. His hand was warm, calloused, and surprisingly gentle. I am sorry you were the bait. You deserved a wedding, not a war zone. Victor turned away from the carnage, stepping over the shattered remains of the balcony door to reach the suite's entrance. He reached out and threw the deadbolt. The loud, metallic clack echoed in the room, a stark reversal of the sound that had terrified Nora only an hour ago. Then, it was the sound of a cage locking. Now, it was the sound of a cage opening. He pulled the heavy door open, revealing the empty, opulent hallway. The silence out there was deceptive, a calm before the storm he was about to unleash on the floors below. The hallway is clear for now, Victor said, keeping his hand on the brass knob. He didn't look at the exit, he looked at her. My personal driver is waiting at the service entrance. He is the only other man I trust. He has instructions to take you to the airfield. There is a plane fueling up right now. Nora stared at the open door. It was a gaping mouth leading to the freedom she had prayed for in the chapel. There is an account in the Cayman Islands, Victor continued, his voice low and urgent. Enough money to disappear. You can go to Paris, Tokyo, anywhere. You can be Nora Bellin again. You can forget this room, forget the debt, and forget me. You are free, Nora. I am releasing you. He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers, intense and searching. The air between them crackled with the energy of the unspoken. Or, he said, the word hanging heavy in the air. You can stay. He adjusted the cuffs of his blood-spattered shirt, his demeanor shifting from savior to conqueror. Tonight the ceasefire ends. Marco and the others, they think they are celebrating my funeral downstairs. I am going down there to show them they are attending their own. He held out his hand, not a command but an invitation. It was a hand that had just crushed a man's throat, yet it was open and waiting. If you walk out that door alone, you survive, Victor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, seductive growl. But if you walk out with me, we don't just survive. We take everything. We take the fear they dealt us, and we force it down their throats. I am going to burn this entire treacherous family to the ground, Nora. He looked at her, the fire in his eyes mirroring the violence of the night. Leave and find peace. Or stay, and help me burn them all. Nora looked at the stretch of hallway. It whispered of safety. It promised a small, quiet life where no one knew her name. It was the sensible choice, the choice a victim would make. Then she looked back at Victor. He stood amidst the ruin of their wedding night, a king covered in the blood of his enemies, waiting for her judgment. For the first time in her life, Nora realized that safety was just another word for submission. Her father had sold her for safety. The world had ignored her for safety. If she walked out that door alone, she would be a fugitive, forever looking over her shoulder. But if she stayed... She reached out, her hand trembling, not with fear, but with a sudden, electric rush of adrenaline. She gripped the brass handle and pulled the heavy door shut. The latch clicked. It was the sound of a final period on the sentence of her old life. Victor didn't smile, but his shoulders relaxed, a tension leaving him that she hadn't realized was there. The fire in his eyes burned brighter, acknowledging the shift. She wasn't leaving. Nora turned to the ornate mirror by the entryway. Her reflection was wild, hair loose, eyes wide, white dress splattered with crimson. She didn't look like the trembling girl who had walked down the aisle hours ago. She looked like a survivor. She smoothed the silk of her skirt, wiping a smear of blood from her collarbone with a calm that surprised her. She fixed her hair, pinning the veil back into place. It felt less like a bridal accessory and more like a crown. I don't want to run, Victor, she said, her voice steady. I want to burn them. She walked back to him and slipped her hand into the crook of his arm. His muscles were hard as iron beneath the suit jacket. He covered her hand with his own, a pact sealed in blood and broken glass. Then let's go introduce you to your subjects, Victor growled. They walked out of the suite together. He moved with a heavy, terrifying grace, and she matched his stride. As they approached the elevator that would take them down to the ballroom, where the traders were currently drinking champagne and toasting to Victor's demise, Nora didn't look back. The lion had woken up, and she was no longer the lamb. She was the one holding the leash.